Hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm going to be following up on the last episode, which was on unpacking and exploring narcissism, and this is part two. So, in this topic, I'm going to dive into a wee bit more of the topics around coping strategies, like what people typically end up having to do, why they end up having to cope this way, and just exploring key elements of these types of relationships. So, a lot of the time when we're dealing with potentially narcissistic or NPD people, we have to view it through the lens of safeguarding the self against further harm, further manipulation, further coercion, and other forms of control and influence when that person has tried to de-enmesh from the system. Now, the one thing to kind of remember about this is we are in part dealing with a very specific form of abusive behavior, but irrespective of whether you're dealing with somebody with NPD, it is quite important to be aware of certain aspects of abusive behavior, because for the most part, people will think of physical abuse, intimidation, threatening looks, threatening family, threatening friends, threatening self-harm. We talk about stalking, harassment online, stopping people from moving on. That might be commonplace and you might hear of that a lot more. But when we talk about emotional abuse, we're also talking about a bigger spectrum of behavior. Now, the thing about this is it can be quite hard to gather evidence around this, to actually document it and quantify it to people that it's going on. And I think where this becomes a lot more problematic for people as well is when it's done by a family member, whether this is your mother, your father, a sibling, a grandparent, an extended family member, whatever it is. Emotional abuse, I feel like it's a lot more insidious. I can feel like the damage and the impact of it. I feel therapeutically working with people, that is the piece that typically takes a lot more to heal from. And it's important to quantify aspects of emotional abuse or emotionally abusive behavior. So again, just a trigger warning for anybody that's listening to this. I don't really like this topic of conversation. However, it's very, very necessary for people. If we're talking about relationships, if we're talking about abusive or dysfunctional systems, especially family or within partnerships, you can't not talk about these things, because awareness is a big part of recognizing that you're not going to fall into this dynamic or trap again. So when we're talking about, and it's not limited to just these things, but when we're talking about emotionally abusive behavior, we're talking about somebody who is using shame, humiliation. They could potentially be using your past against you. Now, this could be to humiliate, embarrass, or demean you, put you down. They could use silent treatment, stonewalling behavior. Now, often this is they punish, isolate, exclude, ignore, and they force appeasement, or what's known as compliance, getting you to concede, accept fault, make a repair, or make an attempt before you're ready, because it's the tolerance or the inability to tolerate that kind of behavior going on over a prolonged period of time. Being manipulated or coerced into behavior that forces you to violate your boundaries. Now, I could talk about this a lot. This can also center around behaviors, sexual behaviors that you're not comfortable with. I can also take the form of entitlement. Because you're my partner, because you're X, Y, and Z, I am therefore allowed to do blah, 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 blah. Or as a sign of love, you should do X, Y, and Z for me, especially when you know, like, that's violating your own sense of personal safety, personal autonomy, and your boundaries. Like, that's never okay or acceptable. Feeling constantly blamed or pressured to accept fault, the belief that you're always in the wrong and the other party accepts no responsibility ever. And that's a bit different from dealing with a difficult person who is maybe blame oriented or frequently blame shifts. Now, that can also be a communication behavior that was modeled in the family, but that's very different from an emotionally abusive person who utilizes that strategy consistently over time. They embed the belief in you that you will always be in the wrong, that you will always have to accept fault, and that they are always right. The intention is very different from somebody who's maybe argumentative or blame shifting in general. And I would argue that the intention behind that is very apparent. And that's the power dynamic that becomes very clear. It not being a safe container for you to be your authentic self, so that's a massive piece. But when you do show aspects of the self, being ridiculed for your self-expression, your likes or interests or opinions, or for attempting to share any form of emotion or vulnerability. Now, not only just the safety piece, but being put down, demeaned, discarded, or ridiculed as a result of doing that. Constantly ignoring, choosing to constantly ignore intentionally bids for connection or when they share something meaningful with you. Now, this is also similar to consciously being indifferent when they can see that you're visibly hurt, emotionally in distress, or upset. Now, it takes a massive level of detachment for somebody to just view you in that way, completely indifferent. Now, I'm not talking about somebody missing a bit for connection where it's like, oh, how was your day or whatever, and maybe just not catching that or choosing to ignore it. Like, I'm talking about a consistent theme of choosing to intentionally ignore bits for connection, shutting them down when they're trying to share stuff, or being completely indifferent when you can see them in distress. That's an important part. So it's not safe to be yourself. We spoke about this, not being able to share with them. And also that belief that, or behavioral trend, that whatever you do share could be used against you to manipulate, coerce, demean, put you down, and the fear of that happening again. So it's not safe for you to actually connect on that level. Being shamed about your looks, so your looks, body shaming, being shamed about your past, then making you feel bad about yourself, about your choices, making you feel lucky to even be connected to them or be with them. And they might do this by comparing you overtly, or like they could do it in implied or subtle ways, unfavorably to others, putting you down. I can't get my breath. Mocking or demeaning you in front of others or in private. And I can think of so many examples of this, and I think that's maybe sometimes why I'm struggling to get my breath, because it is such a fucking loaded topic to talk about. I actually find this quite draining as well, because I can think of many people that have been through this. You can't have an opinion. You're always made to feel like you're in the wrong, so we spoke about that. Feeling constantly criticised, shamed, dealing with threats or intimidation, the fear of being rejected or abandoned. Now, this is different. This is them hinting or threatening abandonment or threatening rejection or replacing you with somebody, or, and that's done to try and bring about compliance. You know what I mean? It's like a behavioral modification. It's like, you do this, or this will be the consequence. Spiteful or contemptuous behavior and communication, making you feel worthless, rejected, as I mentioned, body shaming, telling you that you're inferior, that you got nothing to offer, taking pleasure in pointing out your faults. Now, you'll see this through like smirks, maybe doing it in front of people. There's like an intuitive feeling of when somebody's doing this. It's hard sometimes to quantify what this is like, but you know that they're taking pleasure in embarrassing you or putting you down or making you feel small or not enough. And then often what can happen is when you try and draw attention to this, you're too sensitive, or you're imagining it, or it was just a joke or whatever, and that's dismissive. It's invalidating the emotional experience that you yourself had, and it's also challenging your reality of how bad that actually was. And that's the thing. This is where the power differential piece comes on really, really importantly. So other forms of emotionally abusive behavior would also look like withholding affection, pressuring, like withholding affection in the sense of, rewarding you with affection or with presence, and also taking it away from you to alter your behavior, pressuring you into behaviors you're uncomfortable with, shaming you. Now, this can also be sexually, demanding you to violate your boundaries as an act of love, and from a place of entitlement. So, touched on that earlier. Consistent themes of lying, deception, or betrayal. Now, this can also be sharing things that you've told them in confidence with people, whether it's to humiliate you, control you, put you down, whatever it is, or embarrass you in front of people. Isolating you from your support network. Now, this is a massive piece. Isolating you from your support network and consciously creating drama to isolate or triangulate you from others. Now, this could be your family, it could be your peer group, it could be your support network. It is intentionally wedging themselves into that system and twisting things to make it fit a narrative that ultimately leads to dependence and further dependence on them, whether it's emotionally, financially, their ability to discern and make decisions, because they are now the only person that sees things for what it is, and their opinion trumps everybody else's. And obviously, when we're struggling with self-worth and we don't have that self-esteem, or maybe we've unhealed trauma from childhood, or we've got attachment stuff going on, and now you've got this person that's maybe potentially on a pedestal in the early stages, there's that control element, and that can be very dangerous. That can pull you into that dynamic very, very quickly. And once you're isolated and you're dependent, that's when it can get really bad going forward, because your personal power is being taken away, your support network's being taken away, and it's done gradually. So ultimately what we're talking about, and especially on the bigger theme of narcissism and aspects of those emotionally abusive behavior, we could also be talking about the idea of running very hot and cold. Now, that would include love bombing, coming on so fucking strong, making you think like you're God's gift, there's nobody ever like you, professing undying love, admiration, wanting to be with you all the time, not wanting you to have space. That's the really intense aspect of it. To going cold, the silent treatment, the punishment, dropping you, making you feel like you don't exist anymore, isolating you, devaluing you, and that's a really, really big part of that piece. Manipulating and exploiting you to benefit the self, huge. There's also themes of projection and coercion, which I've talked about before, I think, in the last one. Ultimately, they will discard, and that's the big piece. They will discard when they feel like they have other options or they're forced to move on for whatever reason. Now, that can happen when somebody's entered into therapy. They start talking about their experience. They start to put two and two together. They come to the conclusion, fuck, I might be in an abusive relationship. I might be in a really controlling, coercive, manipulative dynamic with somebody. And they might start to see it for what it is, or it could have been off the back of infidelity, betrayal, financial abuse, could be off the back of many different things. But that person can discard and detach very easily. And they might go out and replace you very easily too. But you have to see that as a reflection of that individual, and not necessarily who you are as a person, because that is their whole coping strategy. And that's also the extension of self, how they see themselves, how they survive, how they exploit others in order to, as we spoke about in the last one, regulate the sense of self-esteem and how they're navigating the word buffer and the shame state. I spoke about gaslighting at the very, very end of the last episode, and I think it would be good just to touch upon this again, just to give it a wee bit of nuance, because I read a phenomenal post about this the other day that just encapsulated it really well. So one of the things to remember with gaslighting is that it's not just the same as disagreeing or questioning an aspect of reality. Where this becomes uniquely significant is where there is a power differential in a relationship, right? So there's a perceived level of power or control over your sense of self and reality. And the fact that they can exert that control or influence to distort and influence your reality to their benefit. So they might do this mentally, emotionally, financially, through control or threat of consequence or punishment. Now, the thing to remember about that is, for some people, those things are true. There might be financial problems, there might be safety problems, there might be a load of other different things that's going on. But outside of that reality, there's also that belief that you've handed your power over to that person, and that's where the self-worth piece comes in. That's where the self-esteem piece and the confidence piece comes in. If I say the sky is blue and you say it's green, and I don't have power, or there's no power differential between us, you can disagree, and that's fine. Regardless of whatever the intention might be, we have two opposing views, but I don't have that influence or power dynamic to be able to exert my influence or exert my control to benefit from you falling on that belief system. And I hope that makes sense. And what I wanted to talk about just on that is because it's one thing to talk about gaslighting, it's another thing to know how to navigate it. And it will come up in this episode, when we're talking about dealing even with some of the narcissistic dynamics that can be at play. And the average person that has dealt with gaslighting, they're painfully aware of how bad it is. They're painfully aware of the attack on their reality, their sense of self-trust, their sense of being able to discern like their own trust, judgment of how things are in the world, their experience of things. That is so distorted and fragmented, and that takes so much time and conscious effort and healing to work through that. And it's not the same as somebody just being manipulative or somebody just disagreeing with you. It is a sustained attack on the senses. It's a sustained attack on your sense of reality, your sense of self, your self-trust, your judgment, and your ability to navigate the world with your own intuition, I would say. So a big part of that is developing your sense of self, your sense of self-trust, your self-esteem, and massively inner safety. And that's crucial, for your own discernment of what you know to be true, so that you're able to maintain clarity around this consistently over time. So the first big thing I talk about, if anybody suspects that there's gaslighting going on, whether it's a parent, a partner, or whatever the fuck it is, document things. Document your experience of what happened, what took place, the facts as you experienced it. Now, when you do this, you're writing it down, and when you're looking back on it, you'll be able to remember it with the full knowledge that you're dealing with somebody that's potentially unsafe or manipulative, and that does have an agenda, and they will be skilled at picking apart your narrative, because this is the whole thing about the power differential and about why they want you to fall into their belief system. So having created that habit of documenting things, you've got a concrete reminder that you yourself can go back towards to look over what actually took place, when it happened, how it happened, and you're not falling under that person's recollection of the event, of what took place. That is how you begin to see things completely differently, to trust over time and see their behavior and see the consistency of how often they're doing this. Now, recognizing when you're dealing with somebody that is intent on gaslighting, you can try and have boundaries, but I would look at the capacity for that person to even respect them, which mightn't be much. Now, you can have boundaries around behavior because you can always take yourself out of that situation, and you can try and implement boundaries around contact. But if it's a very unsafe, very manipulative person, they might not play ball. They're going to attempt to violate these boundaries. There's going to be pushback. Like, there's pushback in general with boundary setting as it is, but when you're dealing with somebody that thrives off these kinds of issues, you actually have boundaries with yourself then around contact. That's why a lot of people go no contact. Now, you have to remember, when they do this, they're making a choice. And it's not about getting them to be okay with why you're doing what you're doing, or that you see the things from a different perspective, or you have a different recollection of things. They might never ever agree with you, but that's okay. You don't need them to. The big thing is about responding and not reacting, because reacting, we feed into the drama triangle, we feed the monster. And the thing is, when we respond from an empowered place, we maintain our own sense of self, or we're able to regulate our emotions, we're able to see things in an empowered way, and we're not feeding on the drama. We're not giving them what they want. They might want a reaction, because then they can play the victim, then they can twist this, or whatever might happen. And that can be hard in the early stages, because you may avoid certain things as a survival strategy, but in some cases you'll be backed into a corner and you'll have to deal with this person. And it's about knowing how to navigate that. And one of the best ways that you can, develop resources around this, in my experience, is seeking help professionally. So this is a platform where you will have a space to explore your thoughts. It's a safe space, safe container. You can explore your thoughts openly, without fear, without judgment. You can build your sense of self, build your confidence, actually get a professional look at what's going on, so that you can actually validate what you've been through. And then also, if you're out of the system, or, you're only dealing with this person every now and again, remember, sometimes you don't even need to respond. Sometimes you don't need to react at all. You might even choose not to engage with them, because if you know that there's going to be a theme of manipulation, coercion, or gaslighting going on, give yourself time. You don't have to immediately jump through the hoops for that person, no matter how much they protest or how they much might behave. You might actually have more clarity just pulling back and not engage with them in the short term, if at all. You might not even choose to. And I touched on this just very briefly, letting go of any need for the person to agree. Validate your feelings or perspective. And this is where I think therapy can be invaluable. To learn how to do this for yourself, to validate your own emotional experience, to recognize and accept your knowledge of what took place, and to honor this for yourself, so that you don't fall into the trap of letting them think that they have power over your perception and take on things. And that's massive. You have to remember, like, for some people, there will be, for some people that are unsafe, there will be this thing that they'll do called baiting and bashing, where they will try and bait you into a scenario that you will respond in a certain way, historically, based on how you've coped before. And then they get to discharge a lot of emotion. They get to be the victim, or they get to be assertive or aggressive or whatever it is. And it's a game. And they know, through like being intelligent, looking at the behavior, looking at the likelihood of that happening, that if you're not aware of the game, that they can catch you in this. And the thing is, the only way that game stops is when you stop playing, when you stop feeding on it, you choose not to engage in certain cycles. And obviously the therapy element of it helps with this, because you can catch the pattern over time. And there's going to be people listening to this episode that will know intuitively exactly what I'm fucking talking about. They're going to know, their nervous system will be responding. They'll be like, I've been there. I thought this was a harmless conversation about something else, and boom, it escalated into something else. And before I knew it, we were at the races, and everything had kicked off. And I don't even know how I got into that situation. And that has happened since childhood, through most of my life. And they'll know exactly what that is. They'll also know the games that some people can play, even parents, whether it's male or female, how these dynamics can play out. And that safety piece is so huge. It's such a big thing. Like, you can do your best not to provoke them, and they might still find a way to play the game, to get the response, to get the reaction that they want. And it's so dysfunctional, and it really affects people. But you have to remember, there's layers and layers of manipulative behavior going on, between triangulation, competitive amongst siblings, competitiveness even between parents. And that's the thing. Your responsibility is your own growth, your own healing, learning from this, and not carrying this cycle forward. And that's a huge part of this. And I want to talk a wee bit more about the familial dynamic now. When we're talking about narcissism, I did talk in the last episode that I would be curious. They look at like data long term and differences between the expression of it in men and women. In my clinical experience, where I see this the most, and it's not to be biased because I know a lot of people have dealt with male MPD, I see it a lot more in the mother wound and the mother daughter dynamic. I see it a lot, and it's just crushing. It's completely devastating for those individuals because it's the attunement thing. It's a caregiver, it's a parent, and it's also the grief that comes with. I wanted a certain type of relationship with my mother, but it's not safe. You know, it actually causes so much harm. And then also the idea of navigating family systems that can be like this, especially if you've got a household full of girls, like the triangulation that can go on, the competitiveness that can go on, the gossiping, you know, a lot of the indirect harm that can be caused through some of these dynamics. It's so painful. Like I can't stress how bad this can be for individuals. And that was what I wanted to kind of talk about within this, because I do know there's going to be people listening to this that'll be empathetic and this will resonate with them, and maybe they're in this system at the minute and they don't know how to navigate it. So I just wanted to talk a wee bit about this because I've had a lot of questions about this before and I've never really given it space to expand on it. So as I mentioned, when we were talking about manipulation and emotional behavior, you'll see this with this kind of individual. There'll be constant themes of lying, editing stories, leaving out key crucial pieces of information, you know, twisting reality, the whole gaslighting piece. Now remember, the power differential is very obvious here because you've got the parent and then you've got the adult child. That's the paradox, because you're an adult but you're not a child, but it's that unspoken expectation of parent, child. So born into the world looking up at the parent, that's the power balance, the authority balance. The de-enmeshment piece is I am an adult, my own independent self. You're an adult, your own independent self. We can see each other as equals in this way, and I am separate from the system as much as I'm a part of the system. That's very difficult in these kinds of dynamics. There is huge kickback because this person, typically being unwell, a lot of energy is used in containing authentic self-expression within the family, and there's shame, all sorts of other behavior to modify behavior, and it's usually just not safe for that person to have any kind of degree of influence or change, because the main person that's unwell in that dynamic, it's like a death grip. They've got so much power and control in that family. There'll be delusions, and this is, you know, unfortunately very true for people that have these kinds of parents. Delusions around the kind of parent that they are. They'll believe they were the best parent. You had the best childhood. They never did anything wrong. They did the very best that they could. That they're the perfect mother, the perfect friend, the perfect partner, and they will have complete denial of your lived experience. You know, the narratives that could be spun around siblings about who they are and all the things that they've done. Now, again, when we talk on a spectrum about how unwell a person might be, it could be stuff that's completely made up, the stuff that's blown out of proportion, to the really, really sinister intention of dividing people, pitting people against each other. Like, that can happen as well. You know, the same themes we spoke about last time about they can't handle criticism or anything that challenges the view of the self. So if you were like, no, my childhood wasn't good, you know, there was times that you were, you know, physically violent or emotionally abusive or humiliated or degraded me, that person is likely to blow up because they will not be able to tolerate that and they will double down on that stance. Same theme about violating boundaries and trust. Now, the confidentiality piece, and this is where it can be so painful too, because it's a caregiver using that against you, consistently seeing that over time. They're not safe to be around. Now, that might be physically, it might be emotionally. And I think on one of the more sinister elements, preying on your vulnerabilities and insecurities. Now, that can happen whether it's male or female MPD that we're talking about, but it's how that's used against you by somebody that's supposed to be a caregiver and taking care of you and holding that space. That can cause so much lasting harm. The idea of creating favourites within the family system, they promote competitiveness, and this is also a way that they are able to assert control and influence. And it's like you've got the golden child, and then you've got the hero, and you've got all these dynamics, the scapegoat, the black sheep, and then, you know, when somebody falls from grace, we've got these flying monkeys that come in, they support the person and take on that role of being the new hero. And again, because it's family, it causes so much pain, it causes so much hurt, it causes so much trauma. And also because you're feeling rejected and cut off from the system like that, that's supposed to be your family. It's the only family that you have ever known, you've inherited, like, and yet this is the dynamics that you're faced with. And as I said, like, siblings might become rivals. Triangulation will be a constant theme. And you might see that in their wider connection to other systems as well. Specifically with the mother-daughter dynamic, they might be highly jealous of the daughters, or others. Now that could be looks, could be career, could be talent, it could be any other accomplishment, but there will be that theme of jealousy. Usually very self-absorbed. Another way of thinking of this is unable to think outside the scope of the self. So it always centers around them in that regard. Highly critical of others, demeaning, can lead you to believe you will never feel good enough. They may use emotionally abusive tactics to coerce control when challenged, play the victim, guilt trip, silent treatment. Exclusion and isolation is also very likely. Twisting stories to paint you as the villain, as the person who wronged this individual, and very often when they're retelling the story, they will misrepresent it, and they will also say, "Oh, you've misinterpreted what I was trying to do," or they'll paint themselves as that victim, and this is where the documentation element of it comes in really importantly and prominently, so that you can trust your version of events, especially when you're being pulled into dynamics in the drama triangle with other people. They can't deal with being caught out. So as I mentioned, this might lead to massive tantrums, emotional outbursts, or further punishment. And again, it's important to recognize there may be cases where this may become physical. However, I do think sometimes this can be contained if there's the likelihood of this being perceived by others outside the family system. Now, that's not always going to be a deterrent, because remember, we're talking about somebody that's not always able to regulate their emotions, and they might lash out, and they might do so in a very aggressive manner, and that's something to be mindful of. They can be very petty, infantile, self-centered, again, projective, don't know if that's a word, projection anyway, exploitative, lacking empathy, encouraging complete compliance, no room for people to be the authentic self. They will corrupt and destroy relationships, often through drama, triangulation, and need to gossip and control. Love and attention will be conditional. They may actually derive pleasure in hurting their own children through jealousy, competitiveness, putting them down, and comparison. Now keep in mind, this person, again, externally, may very often put forward the image of a doting, perfect mother. However, the lived experience may be very different. They may be cruel and emotionally abusive. And that's the thing about the product not matching the packaging. Your lived experience is different. But again, family secrets, family shame, family trauma, all contained, because it reflects all of us. So we won't talk about it. Anything that goes on behind closed doors, we don't talk about. And this is where therapy can be so illuminating, to have that validation around what you've been through. Because you're unlikely to get it from your siblings, because again, due to the nature of the attachments and the stuff that's going on, it might never have been safe to actually honor and acknowledge what's been going on. So some unhealthy mother-daughter dynamics, again, hypercritical behavior, emotionally unavailable, inconsistent, volatile behavior, controlling behavior, any form of abusive behavior, dismissing of the emotional needs of the child or the adult child, competitiveness and competition, jealousy, enmeshment, the idea that you need to be their parent, so the parentification, self-absorption, constant conflict, no safety, and you're just an extension of them and their reputation. And as I mentioned there at the start, it's a heavy enough listen, and I know this will be landing for a few people, and it's not they say, look, this is all mother-daughter dynamics, because it's not. I've worked with people where it's mothers that have actually come on because their adult daughters are exhibiting this kind of behavior, and that is so fucking painful as well. But the thing that we have to remember is that the most crucial element for the person that's leaving the system is getting healing. Working on their identity, how they see themselves, how they feel about themselves. And a big piece around this is nervous system regulation. So working with a somatic body, building self-trust, building inner safety, building that tolerance to be in the body, to deal with the big emotions. They let the body work through the trauma and the tension in the nervous system. And if we don't do this, and we go to counselling, I think counselling has its place in the early stages talking about things, but I think the somatic piece is also a huge part of it going forward. In the counselling and in the family therapy space, if we don't unpack things, we're also leaving things that aren't in our awareness to the roll of the dice for the unconscious. Now, what I mean by that is the unconscious will always seek out that which is familiar. And when we think of familiar, I want you to think of familial and familiar. So family, like what we've grown up with, what we were exposed to in terms of a behavior that we've seen that the brain can navigate and recognize. Now, if we look at it from a place of attunement to a caregiver, attachment dynamics, all those things, the brain is going to look in a repetitive way, in a predictive way, for where can I see this again? Where can I navigate this terrain again? And that might lead us to unconsciously seek out, whether we know it or not, or be drawn to emotionally unsafe, exploitative, or unavailable partners. And that's why therapy can be so fucking transformative for people that have had these kinds of dynamics or were exposed to it growing up, because the brain gravitates to what it's seen before because it's predictable over the fear of the unknown. The brain's job is to keep you alive, not happy. And this is why these dynamics continue to unfold until we work on our sense of self, cultivate an awareness and inner safety, self-trust, and establish concrete boundaries, but also really knowing who we are and what we want from relationships, all the conditioning that got us to this place, all the coping and maladaptive coping that facilitated these dynamics they play in the relationship, and to be able to transform this growing up, or not growing up, transform this moving forwards. So if you grew up in this kind of system, there's going to be aspects of this that's going to be very clear to see from your behavior. Now, again, there's going to be parallels, because people that have been through any kind of trauma or any kind of, whether it's big T, small t, or they had any kind of dysfunction in their family system, there's going to be elements of this that you're going to resonate with. And it doesn't mean, I've automatically got an NPD parent, but you may notice aspects of this in yourself as a result of maybe having dealt with somebody like that. Difficulty expressing yourself, finding it hard to use your voice to get your needs met, or to be assertive, like that would be very unlikely in those dynamics. A low sense of self-worth, lack of self-esteem or confidence, indecisiveness, people-pleasing, feelings of shame or inadequacy, perfectionism, I would also say, not feeling good enough. On a physiological level, living in constant fight or flight, high anxiety, worrying, ruminating, and dwelling consistently in the fear of what could go wrong, being fearful and resistant of change, which again indicates the lack of self-trust, having a high tolerance for people being exploitative or abusive towards them, not knowing how to change this. And this can also feed into the learned helplessness conversation, because as a child, you wouldn't have been able to get away from that system. Being overly nice, agreeable, not being able to say no, always reflexively putting others first, minimizing and denying the needs of the self. And when they do take action, they take care of themselves, having massive guilt around doing that. So there's an element of that in the belief system that needs looked at. Outsourcing all decision making around their own life to other people, seeking that guidance, seeking that validation from second or third parties before making any kind of decision. Huge fears of rejection and abandonment. Now, all those things I just spoke about, can be connected to varying degrees of trauma or dynamics in a family system. Now, specifically, if somebody has been suffering from NPD abuse, they could be what's known as a functional freeze response. Now, elaborating on that, if we talk about fight or flight, we can talk fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and faint. That's when the system has become so overwhelmed, you've lost consciousness. Fight or flight is pretty self-explanatory. We know much about that from, looking at the physiological responses in the body to survival. The fawn response would be what we would call the appeasement response, people pleasing. And the freeze response it's a form of learned helplessness, right? And it's around the nature of what that person's been exposed to. Now, the person's been living in chronic stress, and they feel powerless to escape the dynamic. They can't influence it, they can't change it. And if you think about a child in that system, they know they're trapped, they know they're stuck, they know they can't get out, they know they can't stop their parents' behavior. There's huge fear connected to doing the wrong thing, and there's also a massive fear of repercussion and consequence if they try to leave. Now, if you think about this in an adult, and I've seen this working with adults in these dynamics, it's the fear of the potential backlash and escalation of the behavior, even as an adult trying to leave that system, and they feel trapped in that dynamic. They feel that they're tied by a connection with that person, and the chronic fear of how bad it could get keeps them to stay stuck in the system, because it's the devil you know over the devil you don't. There's no sense of safety in the system, and they're in chronic stress. The stuck feeling that they talk about can be a reflection of the freeze response. But if we were to explore this on a physiological level, there would actually be other tangible markers that would show up in the person's physiology, And that's very true for people that have been in abusive relationships of any kind. The body will hold that. We'll see it on the physiology of the body. Anybody that's listening to this that works with the body in a physical therapy capacity can probably attest to this, that you will see muscular tension. You will see certain things held in parts of the body and the nervous system. And I think this is where somatic work is invaluable if you're healing from that kind of dynamic or that kind of relationship, because you're developing the nervous system's capacity to move the stress through the system, to build tolerance in the physical body, and to be able to tolerate the emotions that are being released, which are often very painful. So the inner landscape, and I like that language around that, begins to be explored. More there's more spaciousness internally. There's more spaciousness internally. Inner safety is developed, which is crucial for the ability to recover from that kind of abuse. So you're able to trust your own intuition, your own judgment, and to be able to regulate your own emotions, to be able to understand it on a scale from 0 to 10, 0 being nothing, 10 being complete overwhelm, to actually feel where you're holding that tension in the system and how that's showing up for you. Because when you're in a freeze response, you're totally disconnected from your inner experience. I know it sounds strange maybe for some people that'll be listening to this, but they can't maybe put the language to what they're feeling, and they might not even be able to connect it somatically. But when you're doing the somatic work and the nervous system begins to move from a freeze, the amount of energy that's discharged in the system is phenomenal, and that's a whole new learned experience for that person. So discharging a lot of the tension held in the physical body so that their mental and emotional well-being can also improve. Now, the emotional regulation piece is vitally important, because you need to learn to be safe in the body so that you have safety and trust navigating the world and your adult relationships, because this wasn't modeled or even possible in childhood. And that's crucial. That is crucial. And this is a slightly longer episode than I intended on. And I might actually need to split this on the other one, but I'm going to do my best just to run through this. So, just exploring now why people typically go no contact with these kinds of dynamics. Because the reality is, they know that that's the only way that they can take care of themselves. It's not fucking easy. When somebody has chosen to do this, it's usually after years and years and years of trying to wait it out in the hopes that something's going to happen, or maybe they don't know that that person's unwell in that regard. They might just think it's a personality thing. They might just think that it's something that they've done wrong, that if they changed, then the system would change. And that's just not the case when we're dealing with these kinds of dynamics. And the thing is, just because a person has went no contact doesn't mean it's not painful. There's huge grief. There's so much grief that needs to be processed, connected to stepping away from that. And also, if the other members of the family step in and they become, the flying monkeys, and they become like the golden child and the hero, and then you're getting shame and, further pain caused from that, you're also losing the whole system. The only system you've ever had, you're losing as well. But you have to remember, not everybody in that system's happy. They can't be, because there's so much control, there's so much conditional acceptance. The whole system is ultimately held to ransom. And I think it's also the sometimes the fear of judgment or the embarrassment or shame that comes with not having a relationship with a parent or a family member. And I think for anybody that's listening to this, it's important to recognize that, you didn't choose this. This person could potentially be unwell. And if we look at this even as a form of psychosis, which again is something physically that's outside the scope of that person's control, there's something that's actually different and changed within their brain. And we accept that this is the reality of who this person is, and we work on accepting the fact that we've had to go no contact here from a safety perspective. Then we can navigate these dynamics and judgments that other people might have, for better or worse, from their lens of experience of, well, it's your mother, it's your father, it's a sibling, it's so and so. That's their stuff. They're projecting their judgment on in that regard. And if you do, there's a helicopter going by. Sorry. If you do find yourself in this dynamic, it's important to recognize that, look, take ownership of it. This person is dealing with a potentially incurable progressive personality disorder, if it is true to form in that sense, that actually stops and hinders their ability to regulate their emotions, as we mentioned, to be safe and to treat people in that system with love, respect, or kindness. They have an inability to take ownership of their behavior, and there's very little chance that they can change this, because to do so would mean believing that they are in the wrong, which in their own mind they can't grasp that perspective. And as a result, this is why you've chosen to cut contact. You've had to implement boundaries, and you've had to have distance with that system, because this is what's best for you and managing your own mental health and well-being. This is never ever a choice that's made lightly. It's usually very difficult and painful, because you have to do this with someone who is a caregiver, somebody that you wanted so much in your life. They love you, take care of you, and be a part of your life, but has also caused you so much harm and hurt. And you had to do this. You had to remove yourself from this system so you could take care of yourself, or even kids that are, your own children, as a result of this. And that's, it's a heavy piece, but own your story. You don't need other people to validate it or accept it. That's your story, and that's that. Like, other family members mightn't see it your way. That's okay. And there's also grief that comes with letting them go. And part of this is also letting them take responsibility for their choices and walking their path. Because you're not a murderer, you're not the rescuer. It's not on you to come in that system and pull them out of it. Because that could end up causing more harm for you. You don't know what way that might play out, and it's not your circus in that sense. What I'm trying to say. Let them have their own opinions, their own judgments, but just please don't internalize them, because they have become pawns in the game, whether they know it or not. Let them take responsibility for their choice. Stay you out of the dance and just let them crack on. I didn't say it would be easy, but it is necessary. In the wider system, when people don't have context, they might lash out in anger, judgment, belittle, demean, shame, humiliate you, reject you, exclude you from things, have judgments on it. And this is the whole shame piece around you doing something you shouldn't be doing. And look, at the end of the day, you're a fucking cycle breaker. You've had to do this because, look, you could not tolerate being in a system that causes so much harm and dysfunction as the norm. And to do so would completely cost your entire sense of self and your mental health and well-being. And no system is worth staying in, for that. It's just not. So going forward, if you're listening to this and you're thinking about what am I going to fucking do? Like, this is resonating with me. This is really landing with me. Or I know somebody that's in this headspace and I don't know how to hold space for them. I don't know what to do for them. I think the big piece, first and foremost, is for a lot of people, it's the fear of what other people might think. And again, there's a lot of assumption around this, but there's also some truth in it, because we will often compare our family dynamic to other people's family dynamics, and there can be embarrassment, hurt, shame, fear of what other people might think. Well, what could you have done, or what's going on in that scenario that you've had to do this? And a big piece for that is communicating your boundaries, and that's that relevant disclosure piece. Like, it's not on you to have to make them comfortable with your decision. That's their stuff. You can respond if they inquire, but you don't have to get into your business. It's your business at the end of the day. And if you do decide you're only communicating that you've had to do this from a place of safety for whatever reason, you don't have to disclose the extent of it. Now, when you're exiting the system, if there's a threat of escalating behaviour, if there's a risk of harm or fucking legal implications of anything happening, this is where the documentation piece comes in. This is where seeking contact from the police or lawyers or support services and people that can advocate on your behalf become crucial, because again, we're dealing with somebody that's potentially unwell and potentially dangerous, and the whole thing is to safeguard yourself and any children connected to that dynamic. And a big part of this, I think, for anybody listening that's trying to figure this out going forward, honour and recognise that person might never have the capacity to change, whether they have true MPD or not, whether they're just an abusive person or not. They could be unwell for the entire duration of their life. They might be unsafe or even abusive to be around. And this is the grief piece. You will have to grieve that relationship, the idea of what it could have been, what you always wanted, and also the hurt that was caused from that. And that's not easy. And this also leads on that dynamic of learning to cater and integrate the inner child, work with the feelings that's connected to that, step into that reparenting role. And the thing is, you didn't cause the harm, whether intentionally or unintentionally. You were born in that system. And the thing you have to remember is you didn't choose it, but you do have the choice around your healing. You do have the choice to go and seek help and take responsibility so that cycle stops, that you're not going to experience it in your adult relationships, and that it's not carried forward in another generation. You only thrive in your life, and that's the personal empowerment piece, choosing to do something about it even when it's hard. And I can see this with people when they come to therapy, sometimes there's massive levels of unprocessed anger and hurt and rage. And then when that's tapped on, then it's allowed to be processed in a healthy way. Fuck, the amount of emotion that can come up, the amount of hurt, the amount of sadness, the amount of disappointment, the amount of grief. It's a lifetime of carrying it, but you deserve to put it down. And I do mean that, because, it's been a survival thing. You deserve to put that down and to heal from it and, to work through it. And they actually have your pain witnessed and, they honour what you've been through so that you can leave it behind. You don't have to carry it forward, anymore. It doesn't have to define how you see yourself or how you show up in the world. And I think when we talk about validation around that, community is priceless when it comes to that. And I do mean that. Advocacy services and support services connected to any form of abuse are a lifeline. And I think being around people that have been in your scenario, been in your shoes, the validation that can come from that, but also the network, having the support network in place for when you're having setbacks and hard times, having people that can speak up on your behalf or signpost you to different things that could be life changing. Whether it's working with a certain person or having a certain support system in place, whether it's somebody that knows something about family law or somebody that knows something about a certain type of trauma work. Allow yourself to seek those networks out, because they're invaluable, and there are support systems. They're not always accessible, but try and do what you can to get that help. The other thing that I spoke about earlier about not being the hero or the rescuer is we sometimes have to come to the conclusion that the whole system is being held hostage, and that's the word that I would like to use: hostage or held to ransom. Not everybody's happy. Even when you exit the system, you might have this rosy picture that everything's going on, but it's not. It's very much the same bullshit on repeat. In fact, it may have expanded out or discharged on the different person, especially if you were the scapegoat, especially if you were the person that was the black sheep or the person that got hit the hardest for holding the mirror up and showing the dysfunction. That energy has to go somewhere. That role will be filled, and it'll discharge onto somebody else. It's a matter of time, and it's important to remember that. And again, when I'm talking about the anger and the unmet expectations and the unmet needs, you might be angry at the other parent, but you might also come to the conclusion that they were powerless too, that their sense of self, their self-esteem was completely destroyed by dealing with this kind of individual as well. You might be really hurt and angry and resentful of your siblings and how they behaved. And if we look at the whole system as being contained and affected by this dynamic and this person, and you can step back from that, sometimes you're able to just let it go, and you're able to have compassion for yourself and also compassion for the people that are still stuck and trapped in it. Whether or not you ever forgive them is another conversation, but it might make it easier to just look at it for what it is, and to recognize what was actually possible. Because look, very often, people aren't aware of their part in their own suffering, and you being the only person that had the strength to leave and exit that system after many years, it just threw the whole fucking system in flux, and they're scrambling, and some of them are scrambling in the roles that they think that they wanted, but don't realize the price that they're going to have to pay when they get into that dynamic. And that's their stuff. That's their responsibility. And just on that, like cycle breakers in general, in any family system, they are usually the ones that get the hardest pushback, especially in the beginning, because every system has a norm. And when that norm's disrupted and all those expectations are in flux, and all that pain and all that shame that was contained in the family system from people behaving a certain way, it's all out in the mix. And this is when you become scapegoated. This is when you become the black sheep. This is when you get hit with the anger, with the judgment, with the rejection, with the isolation, with the exclusion, with all those things, the humiliation, all the judgment. But that does not mean that that's normal. Just because it's the norm and it's been normalized does not mean that that's healthy. It could be intergenerational. There could be reasons as to why this is the case, but that does not mean I have to adopt this level of dysfunction to stay connected at the cost of the self and my mental health. And the cycle breaker has obviously come to this conclusion of, I'm done. I'm fucking done. This stops. This stops with me now, and I'm taking ownership of my part in this dysfunction and in this dance. And I might have to disconnect and remove myself from the system, but so be it. I'm doing it. Hell or high water, whatever the fuck happens, I'm not doing it anymore. And you have to recognize the amount of courage and energy it takes to get that place. It did not happen overnight. And if anybody listening to this has ever had a judgment around, I wonder why so-and-so's not speaking to their family, or whatever's going on, you haven't a fucking clue. Nobody has a clue, because we're operating from a level of assumption. We have no idea what could be going on behind closed doors. And I think if you've been in that context, you have so much empathy for what potentially could be going on. And look, from my perspective, clinically working with people, everybody's got stuff. Every family's got stuff. Every family's got skeletons. Some of them have fucking cemeteries. But in terms of dysfunction, we just don't know, because what is shown externally, forward facing to the world, God knows what's being contained behind closed doors. And that's the thing. Empathy first, curiosity, park the judgment, and if you can see somebody's trying to set a boundary around that topic, or it's painful, just acknowledge it for what it is. And this is very, very, very prominent certain times of the year. Mother's Day, certain holidays like Easter, Christmas, centered around families. There's all that grief comes with missing birthdays, missing the siblings, missing the other parent, all those things connected to the wider family. Think about how much that person has had to give up to exit that system safely. It's not an easy choice, and the grief is overwhelming. It's important to acknowledge that. That aside, just one last piece for anybody that's really dealing with this in the capacity of maybe a relationship. Now, I could probably do another full episode on this, but I'll just give a wee key piece of information. I kind of touched on this the last time about not feeding the drama, not fueling the drama. If you find yourself in a public space and you know that this is the kind of individual that you're dealing with, it's called the grey rock method or the grey rock technique. You don't give the person access, you don't give them information, you're non-responsive, completely indifferent, you keep to the facts, you document the interactions. Massively important, document the interactions. You're mindful of your energy, you're mindful of where you are, you're mindful of their intentions, and you do not feed the circus, no matter what. No matter how much they might try and push your buttons, you're indifferent in your response. And this is where the nervous system piece comes in again. It's a short-term strategy. It's not a permanent solution by any means, because again, with an individual like that, the behavior could potentially become escalating, and you might find that when somebody can't get that response from you, they will try and get to you. They'll try and attack your reputation. They'll try and attack your character. And there's going to be people listening to this that have been in this headspace before. This is where smear campaigns happen. This is where harassment happens. Digitally or in your community, they are looking for a response because they know if you react, they're thriving off the drama. They're back at the races. They're special. They're significant. They're in the limelight. They're in the story. They've got influence and control over your life. If you're non-reactive and you've no response, I get that it's abusive. I get that it's harassment, but you have to safeguard yourself. And this is where the documenting it and trying to go down the legal channels is the best effort and approach that you have, because otherwise you're feeding into the game. It's a bit different when you're dealing with co-parenting, and I think one of the things that's so fucking crucially important here, again, around the grey rock and the communication, is it only centers around the child. The documentation is crucial, whether it's over the phone, text, email, whatever it is. Record, document everything. Don't put yourself in compromising situations. I have so many stories of people that were in very, very dangerous situations because they didn't think about the other person's intentions. Like, you've no idea how things can be twisted when you're dealing with a dangerous individual. In terms of legally, like family lawyers and understanding your rights, understanding the actual law around, co-parenting agreements and stuff like that is one way to empower yourself. I know it's not always a financially viable option. This is sometimes where advocacy services can be really important. One of the other pitfalls that people can fall into with these kinds of individuals is also when triangulation starts to include the child, or if it's the other person. Say we're dealing with somebody that's the primary caregiver, we could go through what's known as parental alienation, where they alienate that relationship, they poison that relationship with the other parent or the other member of the family. And that is just really damaging, I think, to the child as well as the wider system. It's just such a painful thing for people to go through, but it's also something to be aware of that it can happen. When you're looking at this or listening to this, you're looking at it through the lens of where can I get help? How can I navigate this? What's under my control? And that's the thing, you will always, for the most part, if you're regulated and if you have knowledge and awareness of these tactics and behaviors, you can choose how you respond for the most part. I'm not saying it's easy, but that's the most calculated thing you have to do when you're dealing with these kinds of dynamics. Remember your personal power. Don't be dealing with people, places, or situations that could compromise your ability to navigate that safely. And especially online, don't be pulled into stuff online. Document. Don't feed it, but just be aware of what's going on. For the people that are struggling with self-worth or confidence, where there's been betrayal, infidelity, or the person is discarded and moved on, one of the key pieces that I'll tell you in that scenario is that it doesn't matter if you were the fucking living light of Jesus. They don't care. When they're done with you, they're done with you. They're in the discard phase. They are only out to exploit and get a foothold on a new relationship because it's going to gratify the self. It's not about you. The important thing you have to remember is if you try and be the martyr and come in that dynamic to try and help that person, that can just become a massive blow up. That can become another drama triangle that can actually feed into that. And I get the element of responsibility and concern for other people, but in the immediacy of this ending, your responsibility is to yourself, right? That is the most important thing. Get away from that dynamic, cut the contact, get into healing, start taking care of yourself. And if that person is clued in, the mask will slip. They'll go through the love bombing, they'll go through all the bullshit, because it's fucking rinse and repeat. That is what these people do, rinse and repeat. Stay out of the circus. Don't take a front row seat to watching somebody else go through it and involving yourself in that. And I know it's hard to say on an empathetic human to human level, but you have to put your own life, your own fucking air mask on first before you can attend to somebody else. Like, you need to take care of yourself. And it might also be potentially dangerous for you to be back in that dynamic. So I'm going to leave it there because this has went on a bit longer than what I intended. Some of the books that I've come across in relation to the parental dynamic would be Children of the Age and Self-Absorbed, a guide to coping with difficult narcissistic parents and grandparents. Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. I think that's Lindsay Gibson. Um, I think books centered around complex PTSD. Any books on that would be helpful. I think looking at family dynamics, books like It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wallen can be quite helpful. He talks about intergenerational trauma. He also talks a bit about the physiological stress response and how that can be impacted generation to generation. He was talking about 9/11 and the Holocaust, and he was talking about even the great grandchildren of those people had higher base levels of cortisol even in the body in the fight or flight system. So like there actually is physiological markers that we can look at, that can indicate trauma in the system. I think what else? Books by Berselli are quite good. Dead Dana, Stephen Porges, all about vagal theory and stuff like that. And what I'll do is I'll put a few in the bio of this episode and a link where you can get them on Amazon. And again, I just want to say thanks so much to everybody that's engaged with the podcast, that's liked or shared this with somebody. All it could take is somebody just hearing something here to prompt them into action. And I know it's hard to hold space for people that are in this dynamic, especially when it's family. So the awareness around what can be done and what might be possible can make a massive difference. And I feel very privileged that I'm able to help people in this way. And I have huge empathy for anybody that's dealing with these kinds of dynamics, like the amount of pain. Like, I can't stress the pain and grief that comes with exiting these systems. So I just want to say thanks for listening. I'm going to be much more consistent going forward. I feel like I jinx myself every episode when I say this, but I just want to say thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you again soon.